This week we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Speech, Language Literacy, and Communication.
Okay. Initially, this chapter discusses speech and the speech system. Now, of course, you've had this information from other classes, including phonetics. So I'm not going to get too in-depth about this. This is just a general overview of the speech mechanisms. But when we're considering communication assessment or overall language assessments, we're looking at the speech system, the language including literacy system, and the communication system. Speech. It is a physiological function controlled by cognitive linguistic processes of the central nervous system. So that cognitive linguistic, the language is influencing the cognitive progress. If the language is impaired, there might be an effect to the speech system. But the speech in general is talking about the physiological functions of the speech, what we do to produce speech, including the speech coordination systems of respiration, phonation, articulation, and resonation. Respiration, of course, is the breath support system that you use to produce speech. You have to have adequate breath, or breath in general, to produce any speech sounds. Phonation would be the movement of the vocal folds to make a phonatory sound. Articulation is the component of what we're using our articulators to put in place to make specific distinct sounds, using our tongue, our teeth, our lips, our alveolar and velar ridges. And finally, resonation, the nasality and resonance of your voice. Okay, language and literacy. When we're talking about language and literacy, language is a knowledge system, and it's composed of abstract symbols, i.e. the lexicon, and grammar for incorporating the symbols into the sentence. This also includes the pragmatic competence for using language functionally and appropriately. So you have several components going into that knowledge system: the lexicon, your general vocabulary, your grammar, and the pragmatic functions. These can be applied to three major categories: conversation, narration, and exposition. We'll talk a little bit about that more later. But I want you to really look at the ASHA definition on page 25 of language. And again, we're referring to language and literacy throughout the whole thing because they cannot be separated. When they get to school, they are expected to become readers, and reading is a function of language. If your language system is not intact, your literacy system will not be intact, and therefore there will be literacy deficits. So let's look at the ASHA definition of language. It's a complex and dynamic system of conventional symbols that's used in various modes for thought and communication. So your mode can be oral communication, it can be written communication. Contemporary views of human language hold that language evolves within specific historical, social, and cultural contexts. So therefore, your cultural and historical background is going to influence your language. That will be discussed a little later in the chapter. Language, as rule-governed behavior, is described by at least 5 parameters: phonologic, morphologic, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. We're going to discuss each one of these parameters in depth. This is the traditional view of language and its functions. Language learning and use are determined by the interaction of biological, cognitive, physiosocial, and environmental factors. So language is not one function of just your biology, it's not one function of your environment. It is a combination of all that influences your language competency and ability. Effective use of language for communication requires a broad understanding of human interaction, including such associated factors as nonverbal cues, motivation, and sociocultural roles. So that is where your pragmatics comes in, and those individuals who might have completely intact language systems but have a pragmatic or nonverbal communication deficit. But it's important to note, language and literacy are not separate entities. They operate together. Okay? It's not separate. However, they're not synonymous. Language and literacy do not mean the same thing. Literacy is a form of language. So it's another component where we have an oral form of language, when we're speaking and when we're learning to speak from birth through adolescence, even into adulthood. versus the literacy does not happen until the child reaches that literacy stage in the later preschool, of course, early elementary years. Okay. The achievement of literacy presumes higher level competence with complex forms and abstract constructs. So you're not going to be able to achieve literacy if you do not have a complex language system in place. Yee and Niney recommended to refer to literacy as literacies, more than one, not just one, because literacy is, he's defined as a mastery of or fluid control over a secondary discourse, and discourse is your conversational ability. We'll discuss that a little later on in the chapter as well. There are two forms of social interactions that Cummins defined. The basic interpersonal communication skills, which would be your conversational communication skills, BICS for short. And then there's the cognitive academic language proficiency, or CALP. This is the proficiency that you need to be successful in educational settings. This is when it talks about your academic vocabulary, your educational vocabulary. These are higher level forms of reading and writing and literate forms of spoken discourse. Now, the important thing to note here is that someone can be very proficient in their BICS, their interpersonal communication skills, but have a deficit in cognitive academic language proficiency, their CALP. Now, this deficit may not be due to a language disorder. It could be due to their cultural factors, and oftentimes there's a lot of research that it discusses here about the children might have been dismissed too early from their English language learning environments because their BIC was sufficient, but they did not address the academic component of their language, or the children were misdiagnosed with having academic language difficulties because they didn't have that component of academic language proficiency. And one statement here really stood out to me on page 27. It's right above the header of communication. It says a system of multiple literacies would include not only school literacies, but also community literacies and personal literacies. I wanted to point this out because this is essentially what the Common Core State Standards is about. I'm sure you're hearing about Common Core State Standards a lot, politically speaking, across the nation. It's very controversial, but the inherent idea of Common Core Standards is that you're judging somebody on their competencies in multiple settings. So they have a speaking and listening competency that they must be able to adhere to and perform at. They have a reading and writing and literacy competency that they have to perform at. And when it's judging their competency in reading and writing and literature, it's not looking at only one component of a literary example, such as your traditional literary standard English example. You might have other literary examples from speakers of non-mainstream English dialect. Think about the way Maya Angelou writes, because she does not write in standard American English, but her meaning is conveyed very effectively and her language is very complex. We should not exclude that type of writing based on it not being standard American English. And this is the type of thing that they're talking about when it talks about the multiple literacies. It's going to include multiple cultures, and that's essentially a huge essence of Common Core State Standards. So I wanted to point that out because if you're going to be in schools in the next 2 years, 1 year, 2 year, whenever you're going out into the world of speech language pathologists, we are adhering to Common Core State Standards in the schools, and our children will be taking the test on Common Core State Standards in the next year to 2 years. So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll probably touch on that a little bit further throughout the semester. Okay. Moving on to communication, it comprises of at least 4 components: the sender, receiver, medium, and message. Now, this is talking about the theory of communication and how we are learning communication and acquiring it. A sender, a sender has an active role in formulating ideas into a message, and that message must go through a medium to the receiver. The tube theory of communication was an old theory of communication that basically considered it was just the sender and the receiver, and there was no influence in between on the message. It was not as interactive a process as the newer models of communication. The co-construction models of communication include different maxims of communication models, and you have communication circles. Where this comes into play is that the old tube theory disregarded what the cultural factors of influencing their message, their vocabulary, their lexicon knowledge. The co-construction models were incorporating those other things, and this is where the autism spectrum disorders children would have difficulty, is that if they don't understand those outside influences, such as the nonverbal communication. So Grissom discusses implicature or presupposition maxims, and he has a maxim of quantity. You have no more or no less information than is needed by your partner. The maxim of quality, be truthful and say only what you have reason to believe to be true. Maxim of relation, say only things that are relevant to the topic at hand. And maxim of manner, be organized and avoid vagueness, wordiness, and ambiguity. As we talk about these maxims, we can, and if we've had any experience working with autism spectrum disorder students, which I know many of you have, you can see where those might inhibit, the students with those disabilities might be inhibited by some of those maxims. They might not understand that because we're talking about the topic of helicopters, that's the only topic we're talking about, and we're not going to move on to a topic about castles because that's what that child wants to talk about. So it's very important that turn taking and topic maintenance fall under those categories of these maxims. Communication can occur without language, as when shared understanding is achieved through nonverbal gestures and facial expressions. But it does require social sensitivity to the initiations, needs, and responsiveness of communication partners. So the partners have to be responding to each other. But we know that there are nonverbal factors of communication, that communication is occurring without language necessarily in place. So the speech act theory, and this is really fun because I am the parent of a 10-month-old, will be 11-month-old Tuesday, and so I can very accurately relate to these stages of language as they're happening right now with my child. It's very fresh in my mind. So we have the speech act theory, 3 stages of the speech act theory: perlocutionary, illocutionary, and locutionary. Now, all of these have speech acts. That's what the speech act is, what the person does. Perlocutionary communication has a message that's constructed in the mind of the receiver. So I am the receiver. My daughter Cecile is the perlocutionary child. She's not giving me language yet. She does not know what she's doing. But I, as the receiver, am interpreting what she's doing into language. So my speech act is my interpretation of the sender's intention. She's crying, so therefore she must be hungry. She's crying, and it's a hurt cry, so she must be hurt. The variations of the cries that we understand as the mom or the caregiver, that we learn to know about children based on their differences of the way they cry. That is a perlocutionary. It's all in the interpretation of the receiver. This stage occurs from birth to about 8 to 10 months. Babies do not have intentional communication, but they signal internal states and current needs for feeding, changing, comforting, and playing. That's interpreted as communication by others. Another good example is when children start to babble. At the first, the babbling is just one of those early bilabial sounds, more than likely da 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 ma 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 ma. There is no meaning behind this, and yet we will interpret that as, yes, da-da, you said da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Yes, you said da-da. That child's not intentionally saying da-da, but we are interpreting it like that. Our discussion this past week hit on this topic about why parents may not always be accurate and reliable informants. We, as the communication professionals, understand that the intent may not be there by the child, but the pre-linguistic behavior is there. A parent hears da, 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 da at 4 months, 5 months. Oh, She's saying daddy. Her first word was at 5 months. That is where the misinterpretation of a child's intent comes into play, and how things can come across different from a parent's aspect than us as the communication expert. Another thing to note here is that awareness of barriers can help lower them. If a child is born hearing impaired and we know initially that they're hearing impaired, then the communicator is more aware of that barrier and can communicate in other ways besides the traditional oral communication. Or a child who is visually impaired, we know they're more dependent on the hearing, so therefore we communicate more through that hearing. So the sooner the awareness of a communication barrier is in place, the more effective we'll be in treatment. The next stage, the illocutionary communication, refers to the intention in the mind of the sender. So now that baby, Cecile, she has an intent to communicate something. It's the sender's, the speech act, the illocutionary speech act is the sender's communicative intent for how the message should function. So when Cecile says, Dada, she is talking to daddy. She's calling to Dada. But she also might say Dada or da, 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 and wave her hand. This could be her way of saying bye-bye, or that's how we were interpreting it, because she did not have the B phoneme yet. Now that was a month ago. In the last month, she's developed the B phoneme, and now it's a very clear ba, 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 versus da, 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 da. The very subtle vowel variation indicates a change in meaning and intent. So we can tell the different words that she has and is meaning to say. She might also do ba for bottle, or other babbling early word learnings. So the baby signals true communication intent by looking between a communication partner and desired object and gesturing communicatively. I already mentioned the waving bye, and actually her waving is backwards. So instead of waving with your fingers facing towards the person you're waving by, she faces her hands inwards and waves her hand in. It looks like want, but she does it consistently every time for waving bye-bye. So that's a very early gestural communication. Her other big thing that she's doing now is pointing. She points to everything. We were changing on the bed today, and we were on the floor. Her passy was on the table. She saw her passy. She reached with her finger and pointed directly out of it, and she said, ah, 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 ah. She wanted the passy. She didn't say pa for passy, because she doesn't babble that much with the phoneme yet, but it's there. The intent is there. So there's that gestural communication, and also that babbling, pre-linguistic, verbal communication. This indicates that social cognition is emerging, and if the child is not doing that, we know that can be a sign for autism spectrum disorders. And I will forewarn you, as an SLP and a practitioner of someone who treats children with developmental disorders, it is a huge hazard of our profession that we are looking and watching for every developmental milestone, checking it off the list. So I will encourage you, to any of you that are mothers or maybe mothers one day, don't do that too much to yourself, because you will drive yourself insane if you're checking every single time for whether they hit that milestone. Be mindful, watch, but don't obsess over it. That's just my little side parenting note, because I found with my first, if I was obsessing, I was so focused on being the SLP that I wasn't able to be mom and enjoy that moment. So that's a little side note. It's a professional hazard. You'll find yourself diagnosing all the time. Okay, moving on to locutionary communication. This is the formulation of communicative measures using actual words. So Cecile is moving into the stage. We do have some actual words, but not very many. It's the sender's linguistically encoded message. That's the actual utterance. This locutionary and illocutionary stage, they intertwine, they cross-mingle. Illocutionary can be from 10 to 18 months, and locutionary 12 to 36 months. That's why a lot of times in preschools, and you'll see it on the Baby Einstein DVDs or whatever, they're incorporating the gestures the sign language with the verbal communication, because we know that those children can start signing early when they don't have the linguistic system yet to start audibly communicating, but they understand the meaning and intent behind it. So an important element of the pragmatic parameter of language use in locutionary speech acts and locutionary speech acts, they don't always match exactly. So you can have a mixed match between a locutionary and illocutionary stage. It's also important to note that the locutionary and illocutionary can vary across social cultural boundaries. Eye contact is an example of one that might be appropriate in one culture but in another culture. Again, this emerges around 12 months when they learn and to produce real words, and it's in full force when a child can use words effectively to communicate his or her intentions during the second or third year of life. It becomes refined into mature communication as children learn to soften intentions with polite locutionary acts. So my child, Kennedy, the 5-year-old, is well beyond the locutionary stage, is well established, and she's moving into the meta-linguistic stage of learning. Okay? In addition to the speech, the acts of speech, we have nonverbal communication. Nonverbal, without words, spoken or written. It's the non-linguistic communicative signals, intentional or not, such as smiles and excitement, gestures, or fussing and crying may be spared in some children who have otherwise linguistic or language deficits. So we can see the normal development with smiling and the interaction, but then when they're not babbling, when those babbles aren't turning into words and they're not turning into words connected into phrases, connected into sentences, that's an indication of a language problem. Oral language. There is also the nonverbal communication problems that can exist whenever you do not have a system to recognize nonverbal communication. That would be called a nonverbal learning disability. There are 3 prominent mechanisms of nonverbal communication: proxemic, kinesic, and paralinguistic. Proxemic refers to the formal non-linguistic communication by spatial relationships. How close can we get to the person we're speaking to, that personal space? And we all have that personal space, general, about 3 feet apart from each other. I don't know if any of y'all, I know you're too young for Seinfeld, most of you, but if you've ever watched any old episodes of Seinfeld and or a fan of the show, the close talker. When I think of a proxemic spatial relationship and nonverbal communication, I always think of the close talker episode of Seinfeld, because the person got right up next to them within a foot and was talking to them. So that close talker had a nonverbal language deficit because they did not understand proxemic spatial relations about what was appropriate for who you were talking to in the context talking. Of course, we're going to talk more closely within 3 feet of people we're more intimate with, but in general, that general social personal space is 1.5 to 4 feet, as demonstrated in the example on figure 2.6, page 32. Now, kinesic mechanisms, they're based on movement and gestures, and it's a shame that I can't have a video of me playing with the slideshow, because you would see all of the hand gestures I make. I am a big hand talker. So I might have a nonverbal deficit in that I overuse my kinesic mechanisms. The 5 substatuses of kinesic mechanisms: emblems, meaningful gestures like head shakes, yes, no, okay. Illustrators, they accompany a verbal message, such as holding spread hands apart to illustrate the size of a fish. That's what I do. I expand my hands. I talk with my hands a lot. Act displays, that is the facial expression. And you oftentimes might have somebody say, they just really don't have a good affect. When you talk about somebody who has very flat affect, you can't read them very well. You don't know if they're mad at you or they're passive towards you. They don't care one way or the other, or they're really interested in what you're saying, because they don't really change their facial expressions that much. Body and facial gestures that represent emotional states. Regulators are nonverbal signs that regulate, modulate, and maintain conversational turns. Hands are used in some cultures more than others. Direct eye contact is another example. An example I always think about direct eye contact in African American culture, it can be seen as disrespectful if the child looks at the adult when they're being reprimanded. But in the standard school culture, you tell a child to look at you when you're talking to them in order to ensure that they're understanding and maintaining what you're saying to them. So that's something that you need to be aware of culturally speaking. And I know you cover all of those different cultural issues in another class. So regulators and adapters, self-oriented devices that are used with low awareness, such as posture changes, leg crossing, arms crossing, things that tell you that I'm not pleased with you right now, but I'm not going to say it, and my face isn't going to necessarily say it, but body language says it. And then finally, paralinguistic devices, they incorporate both verbal and nonverbal elements. So they're the interconnection of the verbal, what we're saying, and the nonverbal. They include speaking rate, loudness, intonation patterns, and enunciation of linguistically encoded message to modify meaning, such as irony or sarcasm. And I tell you, my 5-year-old does not have an understanding of irony or sarcasm yet she uses those inflectional patterns that makes it sound like she's being sarcastic, even though she's not. A good example was tonight we were at dinner, and it's the 80s station on playing in the restaurant, and my husband sings, and she says, "Thanks for that extra voice, Dad." And he says, "You don't like my singing?" She says, "No, I do." And then she does the same thing to me 5 minutes later when I sing along with the song. "Thanks for that extra voice, Mom." Intonationally, she sounds like she's being sarcastic. "Oh, you don't like my singing?" "No, I do. I do like your singing. Thanks for the extra voice." So that is a later developing nonverbal communication system. So they are suprasegmental components of speech production, contrasting with phonemes, which are considered segments. So those intonational prosody change patterns, and we know that autistic children have difficulties with prosody, and therefore they have that difficulty of recognizing irony and sarcasm. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the language parameters. So as the Ashton definition defined, language is composed of five parameters. As the Ashton definition defined, language is composed of 5 parameters: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And if you look at our State Department of Education guidelines for eligibility of language speech, you will find that these 5 parameters are listed in the definition of a language disorder. And that is there because in the past, you might have had a case of a child with autism spectrum disorder that did not meet the qualifications for language eligibility, but had the pragmatic deficits or pragmatic issues, but were fine on the standardized assessment of language. So these definitions were incorporated in the State Department of Education guidelines for language speech so that you may include a child who has a deficit in any of these 5 areas. You don't want to exclude from that because you will see later pragmatics is very complex and an essential component of
Pragmatics is a central component of language.
The parameters of language. So initially, phonology. It's a sound system of language sorted by phonemes. The phoneme is the basic linguistic unit or segment. It's defined as a sound category perceived by speakers as the smallest unit that can change the meaning of a word. Phonemes only change meaning, though it does not carry meaning. A morpheme carries meaning. Phonemes just change meanings. An example they talk about of how phonemes change meanings are minimal pairs. Bat versus cat versus mat. At is the commonality there, the rhyme, and the morpheme is changing, the phoneme, the initial phoneme is changing every time. So that's changing the meaning of the word. Bat is different than cat. And minimal pairs are often used in language therapy or phonological processing-based therapy to target severe articulation deficits because you're teaching them the patterns more so than you are the individualistic sounds. Okay. Now, there are phones. They are single productions of speech sounds per tokens. And of course, you discuss all of this in phonetics and are familiar with the International Phonetic Alphabet. But it's always good to flip over to page 36 and 37 and just do a little refresher reminder of the different phones of the English language. Then, of course, we know there are allophones. Allophones are subphoneme categories or subphoneme variations. An example they use here is Slavic ul in words such as needle. It's not a complete ul. It's a variation. And then we also have co-articulation with neighboring phonemes. And I was having fun with this the other day because I was doing a phonics lesson and we had a word, I'll tell you the letters, C-A-N. And then we had C-A-T. So if you sound those out, and then blend it. If we do not say can, we say can. That's how we say it. And the is colored, as my colleague said, by the and the placement of the versus cat. That is very clear from the same way we say it in the isolated production of So those are something to think about, those, how our phonemes are influenced by the neighboring articulators. Again, I know you discussed this all in phonetics, but it's something to keep in mind when we're talking about the language and literacy component, because that is something I was doing with the literacy. I was addressing the literacy and they were going and can. They could not get can out of and. So we blended it more, can, and by blending it and not segmenting between not breaking between that, they were able to more approximately and better produce the blended word phoneme. Okay, so we know that phonetic influences also cross word boundaries. For example, the low final sounds of prior words influence initial sounds of subsequent words to be produced with lower tongue placements. So across the boundaries, whenever we're speaking syntactically from beginning to end of the sentence, our phonemes are influenced by the words surrounding them. It's not in isolation. And everything, again, it's in context. We're not producing words in isolation by themselves. I'm talking to you in phrases and sentences and paragraphs, and that is because everything goes together. So the chapter goes on to talk about transparency, refers to the fact that most listeners focus directly on the speaker's message and pay little attention to the actual phones and phonemes. So you're not actually, unless you're doing a phonetic analysis of me, listening to how I'm pronouncing everything, you're listening to my content. That is implicit. All the phonology knowledge we have is implicit. We don't know we know it, we're just absorbing it. The explicit knowledge of it is what is our job as clinicians to be aware of. So that's moving into the next component of phonology. It's not moving. We look at the word stop, okay? We have to break it into 4 phonemes. S, t, right, to be able to spell it. If a child spells stop, top, oh, you know what? They're doing cluster reduction. It's a phonological process. They're omitting that initial S. If they spell stop, stop. Again, it's cluster reduction. They're not able to blend, to break down and individually segment those 2 consonant blends at the beginning of the word. Let's take the word fox, and the child spells fox. We would say this is a phonics error because CKS rather says X. And phonetically, we know we write that. So there are all these components of phonological awareness that go into reading and writing and being able to spell and being able to understand. And this is the first step. Phonemic awareness is the ability to detect and manipulate individual phonemes with words. So say cat, now change the k to and what word do you have? Rat. All right, well, let's take off that t and change it to what do you have? Ram. So the ability to manipulate individual words with phonemes. And then phonics is the association of speech sounds with print symbols. We have graphemes, the individual letter, and this requires the knowledge of the alphabetic principle. A says A says A, B says B, like the examples I was giving earlier about the phonetic errors versus phonological errors. And then the orthographic principle is that the pattern of letters represent syllabic and morphophemic structures. So when you learn orthography, orthographic principle, you're learning phonics. That A-E equals A. I can't do the phonetic symbol in here. But we know when we see A-E, A consonant E, that's going to make the long A sound, as in late and wait. Versus AI also can say A, as in wait. Sorry, that was a bad example for A consonant E. Okay. Now, let's move on to morphology. Morphology is the system of meaningful units of language. Now, you may have heard about phonological awareness before. If you haven't heard about phonological awareness, I can guarantee your teachers have. This is a term that's very highly integrated into the educational system that we know it's necessary for reading and fluent reading. Morphology, you're beginning to hear the term a lot in the last 10, 15 years of morphological awareness. The same thing as phonological awareness. We have to have an awareness of morphemes and how they change the meanings of words. So it's a system of meaningful units of language. A morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language, smallest unit that can carry meaning. Okay. Each word consists of either at least one morpheme. We have free morphemes, which can stand alone, such as walk and talk. Then we have bound morphemes, which must be attached to other word groups. This would be your prefixes, your suffixes, your plurals, your past tense, anything that changes the meaning but has to be attached to a group word. Then, once you look at the bound morphemes, that's divided even further. We have derivational morphemes, which are prefixes, suffixes that derive new meanings of words. Speak versus speaker, unspeakable, speechless. Then we have inflectional morphemes, which inflect word forms to fit grammatical slots in sentences. So the boy's hat versus the hats that belong to the boys. Our inflection changes to, but the phoneme's not necessarily changing. The inflection influences whether it's possessive or a plural. Derivational meanings have a more semantic role in this than a syntactic one. Inflectional meanings have syntactic functions. And you're going to see this again in schools, in Common Core. It talks about understanding derivational meanings and prefixes, suffixes, affixes. They're teaching this in second grade. They're teaching this in first grade. Even my kindergartner is learning the pre-beginning skills of derivational meanings and how they can change the meanings of words. We have done this for years as speech language pathologists, taught that ly, ly, changes the meaning. It means most or a lot, or full means full of, and less means without. So now it's being governed, essentially, or by the State Department of Education, that this must be a component of the curriculum, that teachers must be teaching this, and they must be teaching at lower levels for children to have an understanding of meanings. We can also use morphological awareness to understand spelling errors or word errors, because sometimes children make errors that are morphological in nature. If the child spells badly, like this is a morphological error because they do not understand ly at the suffix of ly, the morphological suffix, or the derivational, I should say. Okay. Now, when we have inflectional morphemes, we have finite verbs versus non-finite verbs. Finite verbs are main clauses. They inflect main verbs to fill particular grammatical roles in sentences. And a simple sentence has only one clause structured with one finite main verb, and then may consist of auxiliary verbs. And then the non-finite verbs are secondary verbs, and they include infinitives, gerunds, and participles. And you remember all of those fun terms in English language arts: present participle, past participle. The infinitive would be the to verb, to be. And this comes into play because these can be components of cultural differences in certain dialects of American English, specifically African American English and Southern dialect. And it has a few interesting notes at the bottom of page 39 about some literature from Edding, who I studied under at LSU. And first off, we know that there is, in the literature, specific language impairment, SLI. Do not confuse that with SLD, specific learning disability. SLD is an educational term. SLI is a research term used in literature for language disorders. Okay, so SLI, specific language impairment. We know that children with specific language impairment often omit bound morphemes and spontaneous and listed spoken language samples in their preschool years. So something that's bound, the derivational, the plurals are a good example. The boy running versus the boys are running. That's an example of those bound morphemes being deleted. You have the deletion of the plural, but you also have the deletion of the to be are. Okay? However, we know that not all dialects obligate the inclusion of inflectional morphemes in all contexts. So African American English, the boy be running to the store, would be perfectly acceptable in African American English, but not in standard English. So that's going to be influencing their writing skills and their reading skills. And when they're reading, they're deleting a lot of derivational bound morphemes. So, however, they are studying, and if you'll see the bottom Edding and Newkirk, Miss Newkirk, Dr. Newkirk is actually Dr. Newkirk Turner now. She is at JSU in Mississippi, and she was in grad school with me. And they studied about whether or not preschoolers with African American English, was there a difference about their bound morpheme use and deletion. And there could be a possibility that children with true language impairment show that more deficiently than children with just African American English dialect, but that really needs to be explored further. But some interesting studies we might delve into a little bit more in the semester, but I would put that onto the additional reading, probably not required, but recommended if you're very interested in the characteristics of specific language impairment, because as we don't have a clear definition of what a language impairment or language disorder is. But the morphological analysis is the closest thing we can get to consistent patterns of errors for children with language deficits. The markings of plurals, not marking plurals, the markings of past tense. Rice Wexler has some excellent research on it and information. And there's the test, the Rice Wexler test of grammatical impairment. And it really delves into those differences. I don't know if the clinic has that or not. I'll have to ask Dr. Townsend about that. Okay, now we move on to syntax. Syntax is a system of grammatical structure. Now, essentially, every language has these components of syntax: the proposition, which involves the predicate, which is a verb, the argument, and the reference, or the subject or object. So what is the subject or object doing with the verb? Now, we have interpropositional syntactic devices. That means they signal meaning connections among multiple components of sentences. Sorry, let me back up. The proposition, that is the simplest form of syntax, the simplest subject, verb, agent, action, object. That's as simple as you can get. There's no complexity to that structure. That's going to be Cecile in 6 months to a year, when she's going to talk and initially string those words together. Want more, want baba, I go potty. Very simple agent, action, object. Now, as language grows and progresses, we want to see more complex language where they're stringing things together that can function independently or dependently and change based on how we're stringing it together. This is the interpropositional relationship, the connections among multiple components of a sentence. So you have the clause, subject-predicate relationship. You can have an independent clause that stands alone, and then the co-referential clause is a compound verb phrase, and it usually functions with an independent clause. So again, going back to English language arts and dividing things into the different types of clauses and how they're standing independently or dependently. And when we analyze that, we can analyze the complexity of the language. At the preschool level, when you're looking at assessment, language assessment, the smallest thing to look at is the mean length of utterance. And just you usually take a 50 to 100 utterance sample. So that would be 50 sentences or 50 phrases. And then you analyze that to see how complex the language is. How many morphemes, how many verbs, how many nouns, how many pronouns, how many prepositions. So when we're looking at language structure, we want to look at the complexity of the sentence. And again, that example that I used earlier, a child who might have come across, okay, on a screening or a simple closed question answer type test might be because it's not making a lot of demands for complex language or a complex syntactic structure. So we need broader samples of them across multiple utterances to know exactly how complex their language is and how much variance there is in the types of words that they are using. Now, as they move on to grade school, elementary school, upper elementary school, there are additional methods to mean utterance that we can use. The T unit, minimal terminal unit, or the C unit, minimal communication unit. It's a measure of syntactic complexity that's appropriate for school age. It's computed as the average number of words per T unit in a sample, rather than the morphemes per utterance. So you divide it into the clauses, the dependent clauses, the independent clauses. And then syntactic ability that involves forming and comprehending sentence structures that are sufficiently correct and complex. So your overall syntactic ability, you must be able to string all the words together. It must be correct and it must be complex. Before I go to the store, I must lock my door. Versus, I go to store, I lock my door. The order was shifted, the meaning was totally different in those two utterances because of the complexity of the utterances. So when they get to school age, we need to be looking at their sentence complexity, the dependent clauses, the independent clauses. Do they do just a bunch of run-on sentences? Miss Powell, I got hurt, and semantics. Semantics is the meaning system of language. It's also known as the lexicon, a person's vocabulary, but semantics is not vocabulary alone. The lexicon is part of the semantic system of language, the meaning system language. Meaning is only understood in context, though. And a good example of this is homophones versus homonyms. The example the book uses is I hear the phone ring versus I wear a ring on my finger. If you just say, give me a sentence with the word ring, you could get two different answers, two different sentences based on meaning. So we only understand the meaning of words based on the context in which they're occurring. Now, there's this great research, and I have this book you probably have available at your clinic because it's a very significant book about the meaningful differences in the everyday experiences of American youth. It is the Hart and Risley 1995 citation, about halfway down on page 43. Now, this book talks about the difference between your average professional family, so that would be my children, because my husband and I are both educators, so we're considered professionals, versus the average working class family, somebody who might have some associate's degree or high school degree, but not necessarily a full college education. They're working class. And then the average low-income family. So they may or may not have a high school degree or a GED. They may or may not be on government subsidies, but they make less than X amount of dollars as a family of unit of 2 or 3. They're below the poverty level. Okay? So in this book, in this study, they found that in a preschool child alone, 2,100 words per hour were heard by the professional child, compared to 1,200 words per hour in the average working class family, and 600 words per hour in the average low-income family. In addition to that, I don't think the book dives into this very much, but in addition to that, the types of words the students are here, or the preschoolers are hearing, are different. In the average professional family, there's much more positive interaction, positive words, encouragement, versus in the average low-income family, the words they were hearing were highly negative. No, don't touch that TV. Don't touch that. No, no. That's what they hear over and over again. So by the time that they get to school, the difference in vocabulary and lexicon knowledge of these students is tremendous. I think rough estimates were around 10,000 word difference between the professional child and the low-income child. So you have this tremendous gap when they come to school that only grows larger because when the lexicon grows, as the literacy grows, as they learn to read, new words, new vocabulary is acquired through reading. Well, if they came without the pre-reading skills and they struggle to learn how to read, then they have even more time elapsed between the amount of words they're getting versus that average professional child. It's a tremendous problem. It's a tremendous problem in our state of Mississippi, considering that we're one of the poorest states in the nation. Most of our population would probably fall into that working class or low income category. One way to tell if your school falls into that low income category is the amount of students who are on free and reduced lunch. That means they do not pay, they make a certain amount of income that's so low that they don't have to pay for their school lunch. And if that's usually an indicator of your poverty level. My school is 70 or 75% free and reduced lunch. So in general, 75% of the population I'm dealing with is that working class or lower population. We have tremendous gaps in their overall lexicon, semantic knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, therefore academic knowledge, and literacy knowledge. These are all linked together. They cannot be separated, and these are all factors you need to be considering when you're looking at language assessment. If a student comes to kindergarten with minimal language skills, with minimal vocabulary, is it because they've never been exposed to language and have sat in front of the TV for 5 years? Or is it because of a true language deficit? So as we talk more about assessment components and how we distinguish between those children, I'll give you ways and strategies that we can make those distinctions about this child is a child with a true language deficit versus this child is a child who has limited language exposure. Okay. It also talks about in the section fast mapping or quick incidental learning, QUIL, and that says that even preschoolers have a quick ability to associate the meaning of a word with the word. And the example, the new word they used was chromium, or the name of a color of a tray. The students weren't calling a tray chromium, but they quickly learned that chromium was associated with those silver grayish trays they were using in the cafeteria. And another example I thought of when I was reading this is, if you've ever seen The Little Mermaid, I'm sure you have, a snarflat and a dinglehopper. If you've seen The Little Mermaid, you know exactly what those are. You can tell me. Feel free to tell me in the comments or discussion thread this week. However, if you've never seen The Little Mermaid, you have no association to what a snarflat or a dinglehopper is, and you would not know what to call it when you saw it. So we make quick associations with things, even if the phonology doesn't necessarily follow the traditional pattern of what we're with. We can make associations of new words, learn new words, just with the exposure and with the instruction. So semantics and syntax, they're closely integrated systems. They work together. We cannot really separate the two. So semantics and syntax, they're integrated because verbs they have semantic features. We have action verbs versus state verbs. Action verbs, things you can actually do versus the state. It seems like this or it seems like that. The action verbs are concrete, but the state verbs are abstract. However, action verbs can become abstract. I use the example of hit, I will hit you, versus a good idea, hit him. Those two meanings change. So the complexity of semantic features of verbs makes it very difficult to separate semantics and syntax. And again, I keep on talking about content is everything. It's all in the context of language. And we have to have that context to know what the meaning is. It has to be meaningful. These are all, you have to understand this theory to be able to know how to apply it and effectively teach it when we get to the therapeutic aspect of our field. Okay. Component is pragmatics. This is a system of appropriate language use in social contexts, and it has different communication functions. But pragmatic competence is linked directly to social competence. We have to have pragmatics to be able to function socially. And this launches into the idea of theory of mind, understanding that what I'm saying is to help you understand my meaning and my intent, and to be able to understand your background, your thoughts, your knowledge of what I mean. So theory of mind refers to the human capacity to infer what another person knows or might be thinking and intuit his or her intentions. The children with autism spectrum disorders have a disconnect with theory of mind. They really have a difficulty understanding that the intent of communication is to make someone else understand what you're saying and to understand what they are saying. Put yourself in their shoes is a good example I use. And then finally, this moves into discourse, the different forms and function of discourse. They are large communication units. The three areas of discourse are conversation, what we're using every day, narrative discourse, and this is a conversational context, or it can be in a educational context, but it's in general, you're telling a story. There is it's a primary communication event. It could be recounting a personal narrative, a personal story, but it's not for the purpose of relaying information. Expository discourse, however, it is to relay information about something, and this is highly academic. So when you talk about, think about your essays, your personal essay would be a narrative discourse versus expository discourse would be an academic paper where you're doing a critical critique of a literary example, In addition to the different types of discourse, we have cohesive devices in the four categories of cohesive devices. The cohesive devices are the reference, it's what you were referring to, who or what you're referring to, and it talks about the different pronouns that you may be using and appropriate use. He put his shoes on, might be John put Joe's shoes on. We don't know the he and his without some sort of referent. Substitution is a cohesive device that involves introducing a common word once the specific referent has been established. So it could be Asian countries where it was substituted for India, China, and Japan. We know if they've already referred to India, China, Japan once they refer to it as Asian countries, that's the continual process. It eliminates the repetition of those words over and over again, because we know if we repeat, John went to the store to buy John a bag for John's school, that is not appropriate pragmatic language in discourse. An ellipsis is a cohesive device that involves leaving out a word or phrase that would be redundant. Again, like the example I just used, there was a lot of redundancy with the reference. So an ellipsis was when we take something out that might be redundant and replace it with a clause or a phrase. And then a conjunction, those can be various conjunctions that can be temporal related or connecting conjunctions. So those are also rather pragmatic functions of discourse. So think about the grammatical components we talked about before with the verbs and the transitive verbs and the clauses, dependent clauses, independent clauses, and some of the functions of those, the syntactic functions, the clauses are coming into the pragmatic functions of the cohesive devices and discourses. This is all connected. Big picture. Okay. So now content, form, and use. These are more parent-friendly forms of and teacher-friendly forms of talking about our field, talking about what we do. Content talks about the topics and concepts of communication as well as semantic roles, essentially what language is all about. This is the morphology and the semantics of language. The form refers to language structure and its physical representation. It relates to syntax, but it also involves the phonological or morphological shapes of words, including inflections for fitting them into grammatical roles. And so children with specific language impairment have particular difficulty acquiring morphosyntactic forms. That's when we're talking about those plurals again and those past tense and how they leave those off. That's a characteristic of specific language impairment, and it's impairment with the form of language. And then use refers to the functions of language for achieving communication purposes in socially acceptable ways, i.e. this is the pragmatics of language. Finally, the last theory talking about language theory is the language levels and modalities theory. Well, I wouldn't really call it a theory, sorry. Taxonomy is what the author uses in the book. It has 2 levels across 4 modalities. The first level being the sound word level, and this could be word decoding, word recognition, and the second level being sentence discourse or reading comprehension. And this taxonomy would be very effective in talking in educational settings because it's across that language literacy context. They're all connected. They're not synonymous, but literacy is a form of language. So if there's an impairment in the sound of the word, articulation deficit, there's probably going to be an impairment in the word decoding and word recognition form. If there's an impairment in the sentence or conversational discourse, oral form of language, there more than likely is going to be an impairment in reading comprehension and the ability to understand because we have that oral language breakdown. This can occur across 4 modalities: listening, your receptive language; speaking, your expressive language; reading, your ability to break down words and read them; and then writing, your ability to take your knowledge of phonics and actually physically write things. So this would be very effective in IEP communication. And also, again, I'm going to refer to the Common Core standards, and I will get a site for a reference to the Common Core state standards so you can find them and refer to them as needed. But there are some great apps. You can just go to the iTunes store and say Common Core state standards, and you can see the standards from kindergarten through 12th grade. And again, there are different areas of the standards, but one component is speaking and listening. They have to have these skills of speaking and listening. They're in a subcategory for language, and that's where vocabulary use and acquisition comes into play. There's a subcategory for reading informational text, which is nonfiction. There's a subcategory for reading foundational skills, which is your phonics, phonological awareness, and reading your traditional fiction, non-informational text, so different forms of poetry and narration. So these modalities are very relevant to the Common Core state standards and how we're applying that in educational settings right now. And then finally, cultural linguistic variation. And we must consider these when we're designing assessment and intervention tools for our children. And ASHA defines this oftentimes as cultural competence. Cultural competence being, there's 5 steps. You value diversity, you conduct a self-assessment, you know what you are aware of as far as cultural differences and what you're not. We may be very familiar with African American English dialect and variation in the South, but we may not be so familiar with Russian dialectical variations. We know how to manage the dynamics of the difference. We know how to acquire and institutionalize cultural knowledge, and we know how to adapt to diversity in the cultural context of particular communities they serve. So we live in an ever-changing world. It's more diverse, and we need to be culturally competent of what we're assessing and treating for. And we don't need to be treating for something that is a difference, not a disorder. So there's lots of language variation. We speak variations of language. How I'm speaking to you right now as your instructor may not necessarily be how I would speak to my parents. I might not use the same vocabulary. It's not going to be how I'm speaking to my students. We code switch, we change the way we're talking because we change it to fit the context of our language. Again, context, everything's context related. There's language variation. We have bilingualism, which are dual language learners. They speak Spanish and English. And then we have the dialectical differences. We are all speakers of Southern dialect in general, except for maybe that one student who's from New Jersey or somewhere in New England, if I recall, right? I'm sure you had to make an adjustment when you came to the South and heard some of our Southern terms like bless their heart. We know that that carries a certain cultural meaning when we say that. That won't necessarily be perceived in other portions of the United States. So, and also for consideration, standard American English, that's in general what we're writing with, what you're expected in academic terms, and what the Common Core state standards are going to require is writing in standard American English. It's not going to make accommodations or modifications for dialectical variation. So that's the question I've asked and haven't really been given an answer to as far as the assessment component when we get to that part. Students are essentially going to be expected to write in standard American English, comprehend multiple culturals and variations of standard American English across multiple literary formats and components, and then and speak one way, speak in standard American English, and have their own cultural competence and speak in their most comfortable dialect and their BIC, so to speak. So this is a very complex system. There's much to consider when you're doing assessment of language and communication in children, and before you even get into the treatment aspect. So that is the conclusion of our Chapter 2, language, literacy, speech, and communication.